Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for this important cancer care discussion, meeting patients where they are. My name is Michael Bailey, and I'm the president and CEO of Aveo Oncology and LG Chem Company. On behalf of Aveo and LG Chem, I wish to thank the Boston Globe for hosting this event, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Jessica Bartlett from the Boston Globe, our moderator today, who will introduce our expert panel in a moment. At Aveo, our culture and mission has always been focused on improving the lives of patients with cancer. In addition to bringing innovative, better tolerated treatments to the oncology community, we believe that the patients and caregivers need help finding the resources and support to manage the challenges and monumental pressures arising from cancer diagnosis and treatment. This belief is illustrated by our Patient-Focused Access Center of Excellence program, or ACE program, which provides personalized clinical treatment and financial support to patients, caregivers, and their loved ones. This support system is complemented by our employees' seamless, endless commitment to support and donate to cancer advocacy groups, including KC Cure, KCA, and the Jimmy Fund, who provide vital services, guidance, and emotional support to patients with cancer. Among the many important takeaways from Jane's story in Dr. Rollins' book, In Sickness, is the importance of balancing patient quality of life with therapeutic effect. At Aveo, we are firmly in alignment with the FDA's Project Optimus, which works on this balance. We agree that when it comes to dose, more is not always better, and the patient experience and overall quality of life is paramount. Once again, on behalf of Aveo and LG Chem, we thank you for the incredible care you provide to cancer patients, and we look forward to this great discussion. Jessica?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Bartlett. I'm a reporter with the Boston Globe on the health and biotech team. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is going to be a really great discussion. This is talking about meeting patients where they are, specific to cancer care, and kind of based off of Barrett Rollins' book, In Sickness. The book has sparked a lot of discussion about what it means to have cancer, how people approach cancer, why they hide it, and what it means to face a serious illness. Before we start, I'm going to introduce our panelists. Joining me is Dr. Susan Block, Chair of the Department of Psychosocial Oncology and Palliative Care at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. She's a physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital and a professor at Harvard Medical School. Also joining me today is Dr. Mark Lipman, Professor of Oncology and Medicine at Georgetown University Medical Center. And finally, Dr. Barrett Rollins. He's a Lind Family Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School, Chief Scientific Officer Emeritus at Dana-Farber, and author of In Sickness. If you could all turn on your cameras and unmute yourself, and we will get started. Hello, everyone. So after my article on the book ran, I heard from so many people that had similar experiences as they faced cancer, or as their loved ones faced cancer. People felt so strongly about whether those decisions were right or wrong. And I think the book opened a window to discuss how cancer care is approached. And so I wanted to dig into that with all of you. I was hoping to start with a recap of what brought us here. Barrett, Jane hid her cancer from you for 6 years, reluctantly told you about it after she experienced a medical event, but then together you decided to hide it for another 4. And so I want to kind of come back to that moment and ask you what drove you in that decision to agree to hide this cancer and kind of feed into what was a denial, it seemed, of her illness.
Yeah, Jessica, it's a great question. Before I answer it, let me also thank you and the Globe and Aveo and the other sponsors for putting this session together. I think it's just as important as we heard. So to get to your question, I think there are basically 2 reasons why I became complicit in helping Jane hide her cancer. One is fairly noble, or at least I can make it sound noble, and the other maybe not so much. The noble reason, I think, is that Jane and I were very much in love with each other. We were married for 30 years, and to the day she died, I was very much in love with her. But I also had tremendous respect for her. She was maybe the smartest person I ever met, and she had tremendous insight into the stuff that she did. And so her decision to hide her cancer, while personally painful to me, beyond painful, very hurtful to me, I approached this to some extent as an expression of Jane's autonomy. And I would ask myself, is she informed about her decision? Well, there was nobody in the world who was better informed. It's an autonomous individual. She was confronting this. She wanted to keep it hidden. And I decided that, at least part of me decided that this was the right thing to do, to respect her. So that's the noble decision. The less noble decision is, look, I was, for the entire time I was married to Jane, I was always deathly afraid of losing her affection. It feels like a weakness on my part, but nonetheless, that's the case. And to not do what Jane asked me to do, not only in this domain, but in so many other domains, which I, in a not particularly proud way, describe in the book, I would capitulate to what she was asking me to do, because the withdrawal of her affection, which happened rarely in those 30 years, it was devastating. And so for a much more sort of selfish and self-directed reason, I decided to help her keep her secret until she couldn't anymore.
Mark, I want to turn to you and ask about the realities of breast cancer and metastatic breast cancer too. Is there room for hope here, or is this a devastating illness with kind of no room for hope?
Of course, there's room for hope. First of all, when I started treating breast cancer, half the women diagnosed with breast cancer in the United States died of the disease, which means, in another sense, half of them lived. Now that number is about 80+% are cured in the common sense of the word cured. So a diagnosis, an initial diagnosis of breast cancer is absolutely not a death sentence. Breast cancer that has spread to other sites in the body visibly, so-called metastatic disease involving bone or some other site, is commonly felt to be incurable. But so is life. We're all going to die. So you have to be careful about the notion saying that you have something that's incurable and saying something that's going to end your life the next week miserably. And the fact is that there are wonderful treatments that work with modest to no toxicity for many patients, just as many patients have a horrible time of it. And you don't know until you start to treat somebody. But many patients in my own practice are alive 5 and 10 years after a diagnosis of metastatic breast cancer. So how could you not describe the opportunity for hopefulness here? So I categorically understand fully the emotional impact of hearing such a diagnosis and saying, I'm doomed, this is the end of my life. But a lot of times, a little reality testing and a little support can help people understand that might have a lot of high quality life in front of them.
Barrett, you talk in the book about Jane's reluctance to treatment, what treatment might mean, but generally, as an expert in oncology yourself, what are the realities of cancer treatment? If people were fully informed about what was to come, what would they know?
Well, I think, first of all, Mark is right about the change, the sea change that oncology's undergone in the past 15 years or so. So that the sort of calculus that we use around toxicity has really shifted much more in favor of treatment with low toxicity kinds of interventions. I do think, though, that there is a place for having a very realistic discussion with patients who have metastatic incurable disease. This, in fact, was one of the research areas that Jane became famous for, was the discovery that many patients who did have, by definition, incurable disease. Now, I take Mark's point about the difference between cure and living many years with good quality of life. But when the specific question was asked about whether toxic chemotherapy was going to cure me, a very large proportion of patients, more than half, said they thought so when that wasn't the case. And so that is, it's not an indictment. What it is a demonstration of a need for oncologists to have these discussions and have them relatively early. There's pretty good evidence that laying out the true prognosis of someone with a bad potential prognosis does not really induce depression, but instead it allows people to have to plan, to be able to face end-of-life decisions in a much more rational way than, for example, Jane did.
And Susan, what is a question that a person or family confronting this kind of diagnosis should ask themselves? Is it about quality of life? Is it the idea of beating the odds? I don't even know if this is a question people have capacity to ask, or is it an innate response people have when they are given a terminable diagnosis?
I think patients do ask lots of questions about quality of life, length of life, and so on. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that length of life isn't the only goal most patients have. Patients want to live as long as possible, and they want to have the best possible quality of life. And quality of life has a number of different kind of elements, and people hope for many of those elements. They hope to be able to be themselves, to be autonomous, to have time with their loved ones, to be in control, maybe to grow. And all of those hopes are part of what people bring to their cancer decision-making process. And having information about prognosis helps them make very individual choices about how they use their time, how much treatment of what kinds they want, where they invest their emotional efforts during this period of time. And so I think the information allows people to individualize their treatment in a way that reflects who they are and what's meaningful to them and to their families.
Could I make a comment on that? I couldn't agree more emphatically with both what Barrett and Susan said. But as two additional points, people are extremely different. And there are people who are fact finders. They show up with articles and underlinings and tape recorders. God bless them. And the people who show up and say, please, doctor, just tell me what to do. And it's disrespectful to both of those people to not treat them as they in some ways wish to be treated. That's very important. And one size just doesn't fit all. The second thing I can't emphasize enough, one person's intolerable side effects is another person. What's going on here? Nothing's wrong. And some of this is because people treat discomfort differently of all kinds, but also because these therapies are unpredictable. I saw a lady yesterday in clinic, a 75-year-old frail lady whose breast cancer had involved her bone marrow. She had no blood count. She was sick as a dog, but she wanted to go on. And I put her on something some months ago. She has no toxicity. Her counts are normal. She feels like $1 million. She certainly would have chosen that. But if I had said, gee, you know, most patients who look like you do, they're not going to do well, she might not have chosen that. So I think you have to be very iterative, back and forth, and see how it's going and not make presupposed notions of it's going to be terrible. You won't tolerate it. You're going to die right away, because we don't know these things. We're not that smart.
Barrett, with that in mind, I mean, and also understanding kind of the basis of Jane's research, what obligations do doctors have to be frank with patients, to describe to them the worst case scenarios in any given circumstance? Or maybe it's more nuanced than that. Maybe frankness is just about, you know, here are the odds, rather than a list of potential side effects.
Well, I think this goes back to what Mark just said. I think good oncologists will tailor their descriptions to the patient they see in front of them. I mean, the title of this is Meeting Patients Where They Are, and that really is something we should be coming back to over and over and over again. There are some patients for whom dry facts and odds will speak to them. In my remote clinical experience, they tended to be engineers. There are other patients for whom a more sort of a narrative, if you will suffice and actually do better than giving people numbers. I think either way, the obligation of an oncologist is to be honest. I mean, we no longer does anybody talk about hiding a diagnosis from a patient. We understand that that's really disrespectful. And we no longer talk about hiding true prognosis from a patient. This is about how you discuss that prognosis and how you frame it. And I think Susan's point about the different aspects of quality of life that are important to people is also critically important for meeting patients where they are. This is another lesson that Jane taught me about how you weight various things in your life. Jane used to use me when she used to lecture at the Harvard School of Public Health. She used me as an example of somebody who weights things differently. She said, when she gets a cold, it's no big deal. She has a cold, she doesn't even go to bed. She feels fine in a day or two. But when my husband, me, gets a cold, he takes to his bed. He feels like the world is over. He's never going to get better again. So she can make fun of me, but my quality adjusted life was different from hers in faced with a cold. And the same thing is true in a more profound sense for patients.
Quality adjusted life is a good use of the term instead of man cold, which is what I think you're typically is
I don't want to talk too
Point
much,
taken.
but I would add something on top of this. I find that if a patient asks me, how long do I have to live? Or am I going to make it? I think it's one thing to say, okay, here's your answer. But I have found that almost the best answer I can ever give is, what is it you're trying to get at? What is it you want to know? What is it? I mean, are you hoping you'll be here when your kid? And I iterate before I say something that I might not be able to take back, because different people can process different things. And I wouldn't say that I'd lie to somebody, but I'm perfectly prepared to let them, if they're making good decisions, in my view, and doing the right things, I'm willing to let them say things are a little bit, think their things are better than they may be, as long as they were acting realistic. I don't see why I need to come down like a ton of bricks. And I don't.
Barrett mentioned an interesting point, which is the propensity of people to hide their own cancer. And so, Mark, how common is that for someone to hide their own cancer? Is that a normal coping mechanism for most people in your experience?
There are two kinds of hiding. I think you mean the one hiding from themselves, denial. But people hiding from others, that's their business. A lot of people at work and that whatever, it's none of their business. People can tell anybody else as long as they're not doing things that are really going to harm them. It's not my affair to tell them they should wear a sign on their chest when they go to work, I have breast cancer. I don't think that's what you meant. I think you mean, have I seen patients who just say nothing's wrong with me? And those patients are memorable. Staff talk about them for months or years. Do you remember that woman who wouldn't? I had someone come to see me some years ago, and I'm an oncologist. Why? She came to see, I said, why did you come to see me? She said, my coworkers say I'm beginning to smell funny. And when I examined her, she had a very extensive breast cancer, which was smelly. And I said to her, I said, how long have you had that? And she looked me right in the eye and said, had what? Had what? I mean, and we've all seen that kind of story. And I think, now, is that healthy? I'll defer to Susan, but up to a certain point, you need some denial to get through life. So while that seems like pathological denial because she wasn't getting treated and she was smelly, literally, I think sometimes you need some healthy denial to get through life. Otherwise, you'd just be sitting at home like Barrett with his cold.
Susan, so is hiding one's illness a healthy coping mechanism, but denial is something to be overcome? Or is it rather about denial to treatment?
Yeah, I mean, I think denial is a way that we all use to cope with anxiety that is overwhelming. Okay. And if we have better ways of coping with it, we don't deny. So it's really a last ditch effort at coping. At the same time, we all do it at different times. If I'm stressed by something and have 17 things to do and another stressor comes, I can just ignore it for a period of time so I can focus on what I have to do. That's a low level kind of denial. So denial has both healthy and unhealthy aspects. And I think it's really important to kind of remember that. And there are times for denial and more denial and times for less denial, I think. And it's often a phase on the way to getting more comfortable with an illness, that denial evolves over time. I mean, people's bodies tell them what's going on. And if you're getting sicker, your body is giving you signals and it's harder to maintain the denial. And it kind of creates more kind of conflict and difficulty. So I think that there's a lot of different uses for denial, some healthy, some unhealthy. And somewhat similarly with hiding, in the sense that people often need time to get their minds around what's going on with them, to help their support their families, to help figure out how they're going to deal with, financial issues related to work. And so hiding in those circumstances is very reasonable, healthy, not at all pathological. I will say that the kind of hiding that Mark is describing, where there is really, very, very extensive disease, is both unusual, but it happens, and it generally reflects, a lot of sort of psychological troubles. And as you say, those cases are really memorable. I've seen probably 5 of them in 40 years. It's not that common of people with very, very extensive disease of the kind that Mark is describing to deny and hide to that extent. And it really tells me that that person is overwhelmingly terrified. And to me, that's what that kind of hiding is about. I think that it deserves that feeling of the overwhelming terror deserves respect. And sometimes it can be addressed and other times it can't be addressed.
I think that's a wonderful comment. I think there's a variant of this that we see more commonly, which is people who come to see you, they listen carefully, they hear you, and then they say, well, I'm going to go get coffee enemas, or I'm going to get this kind of, herbal cures and stuff, and they fall out of medical care. And I feel that that's the most distressing thing for me as an oncologist, particularly when I feel that someone has something, if only I could have figured out how to get them to accept real care, which is likely to cure them or certainly help them, as compared to this horrible pathway they're going down. I feel badly that I may have failed in those circumstances. And I think we see that a lot more commonly, where people just in some form of denial that there's an easy solution to a problem for which there isn't that kind of easy solution.
Susan, to follow up, is denial of treatment usually problematic? That if someone is, maybe someone recognizes
you say declining to get treated, is it?
Yeah, that they recognize that they have cancer and do not seek any kind of medical care. Like, is that a form of kind of unhealthy coping? Like, is a normal rational response, normal subjective, but to seek out care in some way, is it problematic for someone to eschew all treatment?
Yeah, well, it really is a very complicated question, because people have all kinds of different experiences and values about their bodies, about health and illness and so on. And I wouldn't say that in some cases, refusal of medical care can make a lot of sense to the patient. I don't think it does with breast cancer in general, although there are circumstances in which somebody might make that decision and it be a reasonable decision. Somebody with very late stage cancer who's had multiple trials of medication, the medications don't work. They have many quality of life side effects. They have other goals that they want to focus on. And in that situation, I think it can be a very rational and reasonable decision. But I think in general, most people want help when they're sick. Okay, it's really unusual for somebody to decide to kind of go it alone when they're really sick. I think that it's more common for people to, for example, notice a breast mass and ignore it because they're scared. And the issue is that if we can find ways of making it less scary to publicize, for example, with breast cancer, how much better we've gotten at treating it. Maybe the fear would be worse and we'd get more people kind of into treatment. But I think that avoiding of treatment can be both appropriate and rational and reasonable, and also inappropriate and irrational. And our job as clinicians, if we see these people, is to try to help kind of sort that out. And a lot of it has to do with less with what we tell them and more with what we ask them. As Mark was sort of talking about before, when that trying to understand what's important to them, what they're afraid of, what their images of breast cancer are like. And oftentimes people have a personal experience that may make them feel, my mother had this disease, she had an awful treatment, she had an awful life, she died a terrible death. Why would I get treatment? So that the people have what to them are very rational ideas about this. But the idea, our role then is to help them unpack what their fears are and help them understand more about what realities are.
Barrett, I want to bring this back to you and your experience with Jane. You describe in the book that, she was an incredibly intelligent person. Everyone I spoke to, just unending comments about her intelligence. You also describe her immense fear of all things medical, that she didn't go to doctor's appointments. She didn't seek care in that capacity. She had one problem that kept her bedridden for weeks and prescribed herself antibiotics. So in the context of this conversation, where does Jane fit? Does her decision to hide her cancer and self-treat for a time, albeit blindly, without any tests and prescribing herself oncology drugs, does it speak more to her own anxieties, or does it say something about how we as a society approach a person with cancer?
Well, let me start by being absolutely clear that Jane was an extreme case, and I would be very disappointed if anybody tried to model their decision-making on hers. And I've actually heard that a family member who knew somebody who had cancer and was denying that they had cancer, and somebody said, well, look, Jane denied treatment, Jane refused treatment. Her situation is illuminating because of its extremity, I'm afraid. She presented the kind of person who was, she was riddled with anxiety about medical care, about about bodily integrity, about disease. And you could say, why did she go into medicine? It's like a pyrophobe becoming a fireman. It's people, Susan knows this, people run sometimes to their deepest fears. And the one thing she couldn't do, which was interesting, is after she finished all of her training, she could not bear to treat patients anymore. She couldn't bear to be someone who made the decision to give someone the kind of poisons that we often have to give patients who have cancer. And so she completely stopped doing that. And then she, directed her attentions to identifying situations in which oncologists were giving inappropriate care or not talking about the kinds of drugs they were giving patients in an honest way. But the underlying problem, I think, is this notion that denial is born of anxiety about things that patients face. And my deepest regret, and one of the reasons I wrote the book, is that I could not find a way to convince her to get treatment. She's a perfect example of what Mark described. She probably had her specific subtype of breast cancer for a decade. And she lived a pretty good life for those 10 years up until the end. But she could have agreed to intervention anywhere along that route, especially early on, and her quality of life at the end would have been infinitely better. And so it's not, she made a mistake because of her anxieties. I think she made a misjudgment.
Mark, one of the things that I think struck me in the reaction to the book and my article on the book was people's amazement that an oncologist would make this decision for herself, that one thinks of oncologists as the most informed people on the realities of their cancer. Is that unique among doctors to also have their own denial, or have other doctors that you've known or treated, how have they dealt with cancer diagnosis?
Doctors traditionally make horrible patients. But, as an oncologist, we put our pants on one leg at a time. Anything that can afflict any other person can afflict us. I mean, where did we get to be so perfect? In fact, I think oncologists need a special degree of denial. Let me be blunt about this. I go into clinic. I've just had a very pleasant lunch with some friends and colleagues. We're talking about this and that. And I walk down this corridor with people sitting there in varying stages of debilitation, my age or younger. I know some of these people, and I know some of them are never going to have another nice day again. Well, it takes a certain kind of character to then go back and smile and see each one after another. I mean, you're being assaulted by things that people don't have to deal with all the time. And there's tremendous burnout amongst oncologists. Many of them practice a lot less, get into real estate, do other kinds of things. There's ample data that there are high suicide rates, that they drink a lot, do other kinds of stuff. And so I think it's a very difficult path to choose to be able to put yourself into that bright flame of people dealing with mortality. We deny death. We all do. It's all out there a long time from now. We all skydive or do other kinds of things that are dangerous and with impunity because nothing will happen to us. And so I'm very humbled by that experience. And I'm also very tolerant of the ways in which people, even my colleagues, react rather strangely to various kinds. We have gallows humor that I wouldn't even think on a story like this, but everybody else on this call probably is nodding their head. They know the kinds of things we will say to get a moment's relief after we've been in a very distressing situation. It's tough. Some of us need therapy, and some of us don't get it who need it.
Fair.
I would say I've seen in my career a lot of doctors, including a lot of oncologists with cancer and other serious illnesses. And one of the things that really strikes me is that unlike other people, denial doesn't work so well because you know too much in a sense. And you can see the trajectory ahead more clearly. And I think that it makes it harder in a way to cope with cancer because you don't have that usual, if you're a lay person who doesn't know that, turning yellow is a likely sign of liver metastases and has a very ominous prognostic significance in cancer, for example. You're gonna probably say, oh, I'm not that yellow, or you may be able to tone it down. But I think it's really harder for an oncologist who knows what it means to not go there and to go there very quickly. And I think I've seen that in myself when I've dealt with health problems in my family, that I'm very quick to sort of see what it is, but also to see the potential for something to be very bad. And so I think that we just I think that is a particular occupational hazard along with the ones that Mark is mentioning for clinicians who practice medicine. And I suspect it plays a role in how we cope with our illness.
So is that kind of confrontation and abundance of ration and reason that they know so much that they can't help but be rational about their prognosis? Or does knowing so much mean an abandonment of reason?
I think it can mean a lot of different things. I don't think it's about reason, actually, in a way. I think it's more about, issues like how you want to handle a situation. What are your coping mechanisms for a situation like this? And so I don't think about reason as being the key question here. To me, it's more about emotion and how you handle the emotion of feeling that vulnerable and of having to face the idea that your life might end. And for all of us, as has been said over and over here, that's a sort of a fearful thought, and sometimes a terrifying thought.
Is that unique within the cancer space, or
No,
Is this kind of
Yeah.
indicative of anyone confronting their own mortality? I mean, death is an affliction of the living. None of us are immune.
Well, everybody's going to die.
Hmm.
We can agree on that. And I think that it's an intolerable notion for many people. And whether you regard them as reason or religion or whatever, people invent a lot of ways to kind of ward that off. They name companies Lippman and Sons. They give money and have their name on monuments. They publish papers, so they'll live forever. And people, it's very tricky to deal with the notion that you just won't be in a while. And there have been endless things written by people vastly more brilliant than I who study this for their whole lifetime about how to cope. And it's fundamentally, I think, all you have to do is imagine yourself just having missed a car accident. You slam on the brakes and you realize you were just a split second away from being pasted to your windshield. And you have that huge sympathetic response, that huge feeling in your tongue and heartbeat. And, you're just completely responding to that notion but that's the world we're living in all the time. It's a dangerous place out there. They're crazy people. We hear about them. And sooner or later, the hammer comes down on a chamber with a bullet in it. And I think people don't much like that kind of thinking, whether it's cancer or otherwise. And I think that they do a lot to avoid that kind of thinking. They do exercises, they jog. And so commonly patients will tell me, I don't know how I could have gotten this. I did everything right. How many times have we heard that? I got my mammogram. How could this happen to me? And the fact is, it's going to happen to every last one of us. And we don't much like that idea, and we ward it off.
At the same time, I think it's really important to recognize that we do think about mortality, and we have experiences with others' mortality throughout our lives. And those experiences influence our thinking. And so most sentient adults have thoughts about their mortality and how they want to live if they get sicker. And I think that, one of the ways that I think I would critique oncology a little bit is that I think we tend not to explore those issues oncologists tend to not explore those issues soon enough for fear of taking away hope. And you could be talking about those issues and sustaining hope at the same time. And actually, my experience is that most patients want to talk about these issues. The key is trying to identify who those are and who those aren't, and to approach those conversations in some senses less about them personally, about their prognosis, and more about their goals. What's important to them? How do they want to live with this illness? How do they feel about the uncertainty about what might be ahead? What are their goals about how to use time? Who are they most concerned about? Those kinds of things that almost all of us think about to some extent. And I think that conversations about those issues in relation to illness can and should be had more often and earlier in our patients. And the research in that field, including research done by people, Jane's colleagues and by Jane herself, shows that these conversations tend to take place very late in the course of illness, these first conversations in general, and that, as has been mentioned, people don't have a full understanding of what they're told. Some of that is patients' denial and not being able to take in information, but also some of it is that it makes us as clinicians uncomfortable to talk about these things too. And I think the role of, I'd be interested in others' views about what's the role of oncologists' trepidation in having these conversations with patients, because I think that does play a role for good and bad reasons, the issue about maintaining hope, but also the issue, there are other pieces of discomfort than the idea of failing to maintain hope.
Barrett, to bring this back to Jane, I mean, as much as, and we're talking about oncologists specifically hiding their diagnosis, but as much as Jane did hide her illness for a decade, she did seek a measure of treatment. She did have an openness to treatment in varying degrees. Why do you think that was, that she was reluctant at first to address it more wholeheartedly, began addressing it herself in private, and then seemed more open to the idea of treatments as the cancer progressed?
I think what it tells you is that Jane's behavior wasn't simply denial. And I think that had you asked Jane any time during that decade if she had breast cancer, she would have said yes. You know, she wasn't delusional, and I don't think she denied excessively. What she cared about, and this goes back to, you know, meeting patients where they are, what she cared about more than anything else, well, I hope not more than me, but close to me, was how she appeared in her academic setting to her colleagues, to her trainees, to her superiors. She was the epitome of a very strong, self-directed, we use this word over and over again, autonomous actor in a really tough environment for women, which was academic medicine in the 80s and the 90s. And when I can look at her behavior and her decisions through the lens of how she saw herself and how she was afraid she'd be seen if suddenly she was a doctor with breast cancer. You know, near the end, when she was in bed, you know, sort of actively dying for her last year, one of the things that upset her most was her feeling that people were taking away her control over an academic division and a center that she had created. Now, I know for a fact that people weren't doing that. They were trying to figure out what to do after Jane died. But her perception was, you're taking away this thing that I created. You're looking at me as if I'm weak and powerless. How dare you? And she was really, really angry about that. So I think she knew she had cancer. As it got bad enough, she decided to treat herself. Another dumb decision, but she treated herself, I think, because she wanted to have that period of being in control of her work and her destiny last as long as possible.
Barrett, to follow up on that, did the system, speaking of, you know, meeting patients where they are, did the system, were you able to meet Jane where she was?
Oh, I think that the answer to that is a resounding yes and no. So, you know, I'd met her where she was to the extent that I helped her. The word I keep coming up with is complicit. I was complicit with her deep desire to hide everything against my better judgment. I'm an oncologist. I thought that this was a bad decision. So yes, I met her where she was in terms of that denial. But no, I did not meet her where she was because I was incapable of convincing her to do what really was in her best interest. And I think maybe somebody more skillful could have gotten her to see that she wouldn't have lost all this autonomy, and in fact might have gained some by doing something in her own best interest. But I couldn't do it. So again, yes and no.
Mark, how might oncologists and physicians rethink their approaches to patients to better meet them where they are? What are some of the questions that physicians need to make sure that they're asking?
Well, I think that a lot of physicians don't operate in a situation in which they can learn other than from the painful experiences they're having right in front of them. They don't have peer groups. They often eschew getting into any kind of therapeutic relationship. They don't want to look weak either. So it's very, a lot of my colleagues wouldn't comfortably say, unless you had just the right environment, I'm so upset. I don't know how to deal with this. It's making me crazy. I'm having trouble at home. Whatever I'm doing. And I think I feel very sorry about that. I was super blessed in the first 5 years of my training to be in a psychiatric peer group from which I learned innumerable things. And I learned how vulnerable I was and how much I could gain from relying and leaning on other people. But we're now in a healthcare environment where no one is really captain of the ship commonly, although oncologists more so than other kinds of physicians. We've got 5 minutes to see it. I just go crazy with that. I'm so old they can't touch me. But a lot of my colleagues, they just don't have time. They're getting rushed. They're getting into RVU measures of what they're doing. And it's painfully absurd how difficult it makes for them to grow and become better physicians. And our patients really need that from us. And it's a huge loss. And I'm not sure I have the solution. I sometimes say, and I regret to say this in public, but I sometimes say this with some of my closest colleagues, there are ways in which, despite all these medical advances, I feel like we're leaving medicine worse than we found it.
You mentioned you don't have solutions on hand, but is there something we can start to do to address this, or something administrators can do? More time with patients, or
They want the opposite. Administrators, they want throughput. They want you to move people in and move them out. Every oncologist, the most common complaint they make: I'm spending all this time with an electronic record. I'm spending it with peer reviewers who are saying I can't give this drug that my patient wants. I'm dealing with all these kinds of issues that are not what most of us wanted to become, particularly if we chose to be oncologists, where we choose to dance close to the flame. It's awful.
Susan, then what can patients do to advocate for themselves, or to prompt their physician to meet them where they are? Is there a way that, I mean, not that the advocacy should be borne on the shoulders of the ill, but how then can a patient approach this in a way that benefits them?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think your comment about this is not patients' responsibility in a way. They have some role in this, but it's really our responsibility as physicians to try to find out where they are and to meet them. People who are sick, are inherently regressed and not their best selves. Okay. Think about yourself Barrett, when your description of yourself when you had a cold. Okay. We want to go to bed. We want cartoons. We want cinnamon toast and our mothers. To kind of caricature it. And that's true in varying degrees, but it's a human response. It's not a weird or neurotic response for most of us. And so I think we need to realize that to ask people to have a strong sense of agency in those moments is really a big ask. And so I do see this as primarily the physician's responsibility. That being said, I think people need to kind of figure out the way they're going to approach their medical treatment. And there are people who need to come in and want to ask 100 questions, and they need to list their top 5, for the doctor. There are other people who are, in a lot of ways, just so scared that they'll sit in the office and just take whatever the physician says for them. And those people, I think, can be supported in being a little bit more active by kind of resources that help them figure out what are the important questions to ask. So I think how do patients get more involved in this? I think it's very individual, and some people need to read fewer papers about their disease, and other people, need some help just figuring out 2 good questions to ask their oncologist that are at the top of their list. So I don't think it's an easy thing to focus on patients. I have to say, I think it's very challenging. I think good support also really, really helps. And so coming in with a support person, planning the visit with a support person, I think can be very useful things, because when you're that scared, you can't think as clearly as you would under other circumstances.
I also wanted to ask you about palliative care. What are the goals of palliative care within the context of an illness? Does it only enter the conversation within a terminable illness, or should it be involved in the course of any kind of illness, and how early?
Well, I think that people in palliative care, such as myself, would say palliative care for some patients starts at the time of diagnosis, and it can help with planning. It can help with symptom reduction. It can, I was just hearing about a patient at Rounds the other day who was seen by palliative care with a potentially curable cancer because they had intractable nausea and vomiting, and no one could figure out what to do. And and palliative care came and were helpful to that patient, and that patient was then able to stay on chemo, which could potentially cure her. So, so I think that it varies, and I think we need to kind of fit it to the individual circumstances. But certainly the goal of palliative care is to help people live as long as possible, as well as possible. And that means different things to every person. And so I think our focus is on understanding what's important to the patient and trying to help them get that. Usually for most patients, what's most important to them are their loved ones. And so we provide support to loved ones through an interdisciplinary team. We address physical symptoms. We address and kind of identify, as good oncologists do, mental health issues that need to be addressed and have the capacity to work with them. And also for many patients, faith and spirituality is a really important resource for them. And I think we talk with them about that issue and help them to mobilize their own resources around that. In the hospital, in the setting where people are undergoing active treatment, we partner with oncologists. And I think, in good palliative care oncology relationships, I think we support each other. With the oncologist supports the palliative care clinician, the palliative care clinician supports the oncologist, and that can sometimes, help both parties kind of deal with these very challenging cases. And so I think teamwork is really critical. And I think as people get sicker, their needs increase. And so palliative care and oncology need to continue working close together. And then sometimes the care, particularly at the very end, transitions so that it's more palliative care. But I think the relationship with the oncologist is incredibly important. And we try very much to keep the oncologist involved in the patient's care all the way through, because it's what patients want.
I don't think you'll ever hear a more brilliant exposition of what palliative care should be. Thank you, Susan. It was just a wonderful set of comments. The only minor little piece I would add is it's unfortunately my observation that when patients really do reach the point at which so-called active therapy, so-called active anti-cancer therapy isn't warranted, it's very sad when the oncologists sometimes step out of the picture and just leave them in the hands of relatively newer to them hospice-like care. And that's something I think all of my colleagues should make every possible effort not to do, because people do feel abandoned like that. And when I tell patients, I'm here, if you send me an email and I don't answer with that in the day, there's only two possibilities: I didn't get it or I'm dead. They like that. They get the point that someone's going to be there. And I think I really applaud your comments. They're brilliant.
Mark, how should oncologists approach and envelop kind of the family through cancer care? What kind of role should the oncologist play? Because cancer doesn't just happen to an individual, it often happens to a family.
Yeah. The most common thing I see my junior faculty people do is trying to push a patient's family member out of the room. And I keep telling them, you never get patients one at a time. You never get patients one at a time. And if you remember that, you'll do better. And I always spend a lot of time, and they poke fun at me until they figure out what I'm doing, that when the patient's family is in, I'm always talking to the family member. What are you doing and how's it going? And, I ask them what they're up to. And suddenly you see the interaction between these people, and everything becomes much clearer about what's going on. Some of it demands cultural sophistication, by which I mean, I was recently practicing in Florida, in the Miami area, and the interactions then I would have 3 times as many people in the room with the patient as anywhere else, because no one came without their mother and their sister and their daughter, and they're all crowded in the room. And as soon as you try to get rid of them, you're making a gigantic mistake. So you just need to learn how people interact as family units. And the more you involve them all together, the better it's going to be, for sure.
Susan, what also strikes me too in the conversation of palliative care and end of life decisions, and I mean, it seems like things that people should be thinking about, discussions they should be having, even outside the context of an illness. So what kinds of questions should people ask themselves, just as they age, as they live? How should these lessons be borne by those who have not yet confronted an illness?
Well, I think the kinds of questions that people should ask are things like, well, what's most important to me if I were to get sick? And who would I want around me? And how how much am I willing to go through with a serious illness? There's some people who say very clearly that, they don't want to go through a lot. They really want to kind of minimize the intervention. They want to minimize the efforts at, intensive treatment, and they're willing to accept the trade-off, which is that they might live shorter. Sometimes they don't, I would also add. Sometimes they live longer if they don't do this. But what are the kinds of trade-offs they're willing to make for a longer life and for better quality of life? And then I think also, thinking about what kind of involvement do you want your family to have in your illness? There's some patients and families where every decision needs to be made together. Margaret's alluding to that a minute ago. And there are other situations where the patient really wants to make all the decisions him or herself, and they don't want their family to know very much about what's going on. And so getting people to think about these kinds of questions is really, really important. I don't think people need to sit to think about and really can think in a useful way about, do I want to be on a ventilator? Do I want to have dialysis? Do I want to have this? Do I want to have that? Because they don't know the context in which they're going to be making those decisions. And we know that people can't predict very well what they're going to want in those situations. So these broader, more general questions about values and goals are much more useful. And then the important thing is they should talk to their loved ones about what they feel about these things, as difficult as it can be. And as often as loved ones say, no, I don't want to go there with you, that it's really important for somebody to know what your feelings are, just in case you can't speak for yourself at a certain point in your illness.
Mm.
Well, I
Barrett,
agree with that, but particularly about legal directives. I've seen any number of horrible situations in which things go off the rails because there weren't either respect for or documented wishes of the patient about how they wanted to be. I grant what you said about respirators, who knows what they're like, but that's true. And there are certain illnesses, not just cancer, which do appear pretty inexorable and pretty much progressive. ALS is one that comes to mind, Lou Gehrig's disease. And I've had any number of conversations with all kinds of people, colleagues and others. Well, how much would you give up? Would you give up a foot? Would you give up, would you be in a wheelchair? Are you willing to be on crutches? What if you had to be fed through a tube? Where do you bargain? What will you do? And I agree with Susan enormously that it's best to try to get as much of this as you can tolerate out in the open.
Barrett, I want to close this with you. We have just about a couple minutes left. Reflecting on this conversation, reflecting on the response to your book, your own experience, would you have done anything differently?
The response to the book has been enlightening. As you yourself saw, Jessica, there is a large part of an iceberg that's still under the ocean of people who are very actively denying and hiding their disease. And a lot of responses that we got to your article, and a lot of personal responses that I've gotten, talk about family members who did that. And there's now this sort of conversation that started about, well, what should I have done differently? What could I have done differently? Should I have done anything differently? And that's sort of what you're asking me. And I would go back to what I said earlier, that as Jane's spouse, as someone who loved her very deeply, and witnessed a truly miserable final year of her life, I would give a lot to be able to go back and convince her to intervene earlier, so that when the end came, because as Mark has told us, we're all going to die, so that when the end came, it wasn't as miserable as it was for Jane, which is ironic because this is somebody who grounded almost all of her research work in issues around quality. And I just wish I could have figured out a way to get her to see the pathway towards improving the quality of her last year.
Well, thank you all so much for a really robust and thoughtful conversation. I greatly appreciate all of your expertise, and thank you for joining me and the Globe for this conversation today. Hope you enjoyed it at home, and stay tuned for more Globe events. Thanks so
Thanks,
much.
Jessica.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.